Hello and welcome back to a new Rise beta video. This time I'm talking about the surprise monster hunt we're doing throughout this beta, and of course Rise, everyone's favourite bubble boy, Mizutsune. Our lovely Leviathan returns to the series alongside other Leviathans such as the Royal Ludroth. Mizo even got a special nod to his cinematic from Generations in the recent trailer for Rise 2. Today we're going to talk about what Mizutsune is, aka what's so special about this monster, and what him being in Rise might imply. And of course his moveset, location, tips and tricks to beat him, and lastly my thoughts. Mizutsune is a beautiful monster, especially evolved Leviathan that can be compared to an Eastern style dragon. However, this bubble boy can secrete its own fluid that when rubbed against its scales generates those bubbles, terrifying. These bubbles are meant to immobilize its targets, forcing them to slip and slide or just get stuck entirely. Using its own slides and springs, Mizu will then close in with its dance-like movements to complete its hunt. To say the least, Mizu is even more slidey and more springy, and yes, even more bubbly in Rise. I think that's probably because our movement is insane in Rise 2, so the pace of the fight needed to be raised. However, I do want to mention that Mizutsune's return does imply something pretty important. Have you ever heard of the Fated Four? Four monsters introduced to the series in Generations. These were the four flagship monsters for the game at the time. These were Astalos, my favourite of the four, Gammoth, the big mammoth, Glavenus and his tail sword, and lastly, Mizutsune himself. And considering how we're seeing returning monsters like these Leviathan types, could we be seeing the return of the other four in Rise? Well, Glavenus was in World and the other three were obviously not, but hey, there is literally a perfect ice region for Gammoth just revealed called the Frost Islands, so maybe? Now let's talk about Mizu. Where can we find him? Perhaps we'll see him in other locales in the full release, but for the duration of the demo, we'll be fighting him in the Shrine Ruins. He will begin his fight on the left side of the map, along that long river with its waterfalls leading down all the way to the camp we start at. Generally, you will find him immediately at Area 2, 6 or 13 along that river. Mizu will always like to be around water, which might shock or surprise you, so throughout the whole hunt he will try to stick to areas with water. This means he can move through to Area 1, 10 or 9, but occasionally he will move between those areas as he travels to the next water area of his choice. So you could actually catch him without any of his precious water if you wanted. During this specific hunt in the demo, we also find a Izuchi and a Rathian on that map, which I definitely suggest you make use of with some Wyvern Riding, or maybe Stinkminks to draw the monsters into a fight with one another. That's all well and good, but what does he actually do? I'm going to cut his moveset into 3 stages: Standard Mode, Enraged Mode, and Exhausted Mode. Throughout that whole fight, you will be dealing with his core and most interesting mechanic of all, the bubbles. Mizutsune will generate bubbles in various amounts throughout the whole fight, even more so when he's enraged. These bubbles will spiral out and around Mizu, which is a new effect for Rise. You see, originally Mizu used these bubbles more as projectiles, while the deviant version, the Soul Seer Mizu, would create spiral auras of bubbles. So basically what's happened here is the Rise version has adapted the moveset to be more like the deviant. The bubbles come in 4 forms: white, red, green, and bloody massive, mate. All variations give you bubble blight when you touch it, which goes through 2 stages. At any time you can remove the blight with, say, a nullberry, or by being hit by any source. Stage 1 of this bubble blight ain't so bad. You have the blight and some bubbles on your character, and you actually get slightly better evasion. However, stage 2 is something you might need to worry about. When you're hit by 2 bubbles, or the 4th form of the bubble, which is the bloody massive mate version, you will reach stage 2. Now you're going to be slipping and sliding. This is a lot more dangerous because it prevents your normal movement initially as you begin to slip and slide. And then after a moment, as you recover, you'll be moving pretty quickly. That can actually be useful for evading attacks and positioning, but obviously as soon as you stop to attack and then try move again, you will begin to slip before speeding up. So be very careful with that one, and maybe use a nullberry. The red and green bubbles are rarer, but do occasionally appear through the fight, or more often in the enrage. If you were to pop a red bubble by hitting it or walking into it, you will get a temporary attack buff. Or with the green version, you'll get health in return. Ideally, you break the bubble rather than running into it to avoid the blight, but I think these bubbles create a really fun and unique fight. And with the new spiral nature of these bubbles, it just requires a lot more movement to avoid, and it feels great. great. The major change here is you can fight while affected by the stage 2 of Bubble Blight. As in the past, you couldn't draw your weapon when this was happening, so this gives us a chance to accept the Blight and fight with it rather than it being a problem only. What generates the bubbles though? Well, various attacks will cause these to spawn. Primarily, you will see these when Mizu spins or slides, releasing multiple bubbles at once and even more when he enrages. Like I said, these will spiral out and around on spins and pop after a period. However, we will see these bubbles from the tail flip attack at range when it comes out in a cone in front of Mizu, or there's the bloody massive bubble shots which will be fired at a medium range and work to reposition Mizu as he jumps forward or backwards depending on the shot. Outside of the bubble based attacks, Mizu does a few regular bite attacks, swipes and dashes, but he does have some other tricks. A main attack to watch out for is definitely the wind up leap. He'll stand higher and wind up, arching his back, then leaping forward and try to crush the target. This will do some nasty damage, but it's obviously very telegraphed so you can run to the side before it actually occurs. And on top of all of that, we also have the water beams. Mizu is able to create a jet of water that functions like a beam of pain that will afflict the hunter with Water Blight if hit. Water Blight causes your stamina to recover slower, so removing that effect with, say, a Nullberry or a Cleanser would be a good idea. These beams are deadly though, they do some good damage and they have insane range. The most exciting has to be the big 360 beam, as Mizu winds up and begins sending that beam slowly in a circle around him. This is really fun to dodge by leaping over with a Wirebug, or yeah, you can just run around it. Otherwise, we do have other versions of the beam, one being the vertical beam and the other being the horizontal, which comes in sort of a 180 degrees in front of Mizu to watch out for. Things get really interesting when he enrages though. When enraged, Mizu will turn a darker red and purple, with the white of the scales basically fading. It's going to be very hard to miss that because it genuinely does look so good. During the enrage, many attacks we mentioned are modified for greater effect and are now much more deadly. Mainly, you'll notice that there's going to be more beams, more bubbles, and more movement. For example, that spin attack that releases multiple bubbles now releases many more, and he can even do a backward spin to do even more. Naturally, with that, you'll see more red and green bubbles to take advantage of. During that phase, Mizu will slip and slide, and whenever he does slide, that will also generate bubbles, so be aware. We'll see more bloody massive bubble shots, and those beams will come out more suddenly, so make sure you aren't standing in front of Mizu at, say, a medium or even long range. The key change in this fight to watch out for, though, is the movement of Mizu. Because he's jumping and sliding around much more aggressively, it's going to be a bit harder to keep track of him and all the bubbles at once. Most everything he does will have a greater range, be a bit quicker, be a bit more deadly, and come in more aggressive combos. I mean, even that 360 beam spin actually goes quicker now too. During this phase of the fight though, we do have two new moves to think about. Firstly, after a sudden dash backwards, Mizu will wind up and leap forward, which will be foretold by a whizzing sound effect. Then he will leap and spin on impact. If you're hit by that, you'll get Bubble Blight, and the attack itself can generate more bubbles too. Absolutely avoid this attack by moving to the sides or just leaping to avoid all damage. And secondly, the best move was saved for last, guys. This entirely new sliding water beam attack. Holy crap, is this cool. Mizu literally drifts like he's in a Fast and Furious film, all the while spraying his water beam in front of him for huge range, moving to cover a massive area in this attack. This is definitely another one to leap over with a Wirebug to feel like a bit of a badass. This is easy to be hit by if you're not ready to use a Wirebug to save yourself, so just a heads up, be looking for this. It's an incredible addition to his kit, and I absolutely love the added speed to this fight overall. Interestingly, we do see a few things gone from the fight now. For example, his more common huge bubble attacks. He used to shoot them out more aggressively, even shooting 3 at once in a cone. Instead of that, we see Mizu leaping and sliding more often, and obviously we see more smaller bubbles by comparison. Now the bubbles are spiraling outward, unlike the original, as we mentioned, more like the deviant form, and he doesn't actually leave bubbles on the ground anymore as that sort of mine effect of the past. To say the least, the fight has become more like the concept of the monster, less limited and by far more mobile, which is nothing but fantastic. Lastly though, the final state of the Mizutsune is when he's all tuckered out. Just like any monster, Mizu will eventually tire, providing you with ample opportunities to deal some real damage. When a monster is tired, it's going to be a lot slower and more manageable, though much more likely to run away to another area too. We can trigger this exhaust ourselves with exhaust damage, like say a switch axe with exhaust vials, or by using endemic life. This could be something that you focus in certain fights, not just this one, but any tough fight you're dealing with. But as we move on, let's talk about the last major mechanic for Mizu. This is a new one, right? Wyvern Riding. Just like any monster, we will build up our mount potential with any Wirebug aerial, silkbind attack, other monster damage, and of course, endemic life. My tip for any and all mounts is to go grab yourself a puppet spider before you actually start a fight. These little dudes will trigger a mount from 0 to 100 in a single use, so take advantage of that like me. I go grab a Rathian before I even start fighting Mizu, because I'd rather hit him with a Rathian. Once we've actually mounted Mizu himself, we get this incredible high up view due to the sheer length and size of him. Obviously, you want to damage Mizu if you're hunting him, right? So I definitely recommend you repeat charge into walls or whatever while evading correctly to maintain that mount. Then smash him finally to stagger into something and bind him to the area. That way you can get tons of damage on Mizu and also get more out when you're on the ground. However, you might want to actually use Mizu to attack other monsters, right? Maybe to deal mount damage so you could use another monster against him later. Or you might be hunting something else and Mizu's just in the area. If that's the case, I strongly recommend you use Mizu as a combat mount if he's ever around, if you're ever hunting anything else, because he can trigger the Water Blight with his Water Beam attack. Water Blight, when used on another monster, does something different. It softens its hide, which appears to make it take more damage while it's affected. So yeah, Tenderize. This only works when used on other monsters, but it is something you must take advantage of whenever possible. That aside though, let's explain some of the various attacks Mizu has while he is mounted. Mizu's light attack performs a double claw swipe, which does leave you vulnerable for a short time after you use it. Being able to spam such a large swiping attack like this is really good, because honestly the stagger isn't too bad and the damage is pretty good. This can be comboed into a water beam attack though, both vertical and horizontal versions, which is obviously a great way to trigger that Water Blight on another monster. The heavy attack is the iconic bubble shot of Mizu leaping forward to spit out some bubbles. This has reasonable range, but maybe shouldn't be done on small targets when too close, because you do leap pretty far forward, you might miss entirely. What we all care for most, however, is that mounted Punisher. When ready, you'll force Mizu to dash side to side and then leap up and onto your target monster. The dashes will generate bubbles, which deal extra bits of damage, but the leap is what's going to do the most, so you need to make sure that lands. This is a massive attack based solely on how far Mizu moves during those slides, dealing damage to anything inside of the area. It is a brilliant punish attack, and obviously the best one in the demo. With all that said though, I only have one last tip for Mizu. It's about where to target. As much as his face is definitely a scary place to be standing because of all those attacks he has from it, it is maybe the ideal spot to hit due to the great damage and obviously KO values for a knockdown. However, it's much safer to remain on his flanks, at the front area or the back, depending on what you're trying to do, targeting his claws and limbs or maybe the tail. If you do knock down Mizu or attack with aerials, the middle of the spine where all those scales peak the highest is another good vulnerable spot. Just be careful when you're hitting the face. Try to attack just after he throws out a move, because often he'll need to recover for a brief moment, and that could be, say, your window of opportunity. But there you have it. That was a lot to say about just one monster, but honestly, Mizutsune definitely deserves the attention. I'm really happy to have him back because he was easily one of my favorite monsters in my time playing GU. The whole concept behind the bubbles is really fun, and with the new changes in Rise making him more agile and slidey and even more bubbly, it's just better. Thanks to our new movement in Rise, it's not necessarily a surprise that they up the pace of this fight, because it feels totally right. I hope you guys are enjoying this fight in the demo, or if you're watching him even after launch. Hopefully the Fated Four do return in Rise and we get to experience the rest of them. What do you guys think about Mizu? I expect a lot of people are going to love him. Either way, thank you very much for watching. I've been Hollow, you've been you, and I'll see you next time.